So let us summarize that. The scenario that they lived in was life-threatening, flooded with Gnosticism. In Corinth, a lot of Greek influence, arguments and fighting between people, a desire to also live in peace with other people. Another point that we can bring in here is easy evangelism. If you can tell people, listen, what you already believe is already 90% true, the only thing that makes it possible is the resurrection of Jesus, it would be easier to evangelize. So there are many things that played a role wherein people could be tempted to change their view of the resurrection. But Paul comes and he says, and he defines the resurrection as something physical. Now, I forgot to bring the notes, but I forgot my the Wisdom of Solomon. But I asked you guys to bring to print out the Wisdom of Solomon, which I sent to you. The book of the Wisdom of Solomon is one of the books in the Apocrypha. Now, that book is not part of our canon. Yet the Apostle Paul uses it 76 times in his letter to Romans, 24 times in his letter to the people in Corinth. That is what he does. And when we look at the background of that passage, we find that, thank you, Elena, we find that this book of the Wisdom of Solomon describes what the people in that time believed, and it helps us to see what the background was, what they would define as death, and what Paul would believe death was. I don't believe that the book of the Wisdom of Solomon should be in the canon. It's not important to put in there, because whatever it says, Paul has already summarized and put in his letter to the Romans, to the Corinthians. Things like we will reign over angels and we will reign over nations in the new kingdom, and those kind of things was found here. And one of the things that was found, and that we clearly see here, is what these people thought about death and what death was. One of the views about death was complete annihilation, wherein you are just nothing. And like I said, one of the views was that nobody can ever come back from the dead. And I'm going to read that from the Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 2 and verse 1. It says, "For they have said, reasoning in themselves, but not right, the time of our life is short and tedious, and the end of a man, at the end of man there is no remedy, and no man has been known to have returned from hell or the abode of the dead. For we are born of nothing, and this shall we be, as if we have not been. For the breath of our nostril is smoke, the speech a spark to move our hearts, which being put out, our bodies shall be ashes, our spirit shall be poured abroad as soft air, and our life shall pass away in the trace of a cloud, and shall be dispersed as a mist, which is driven away by the beams of the sun, and overpowered with the heat thereof. And our name shall be forgotten, and no man shall have any remembrance of our works. For our time is passing of a shadow, and there is no going back of our end. For it is fast sealed, and no man returns. Come therefore, let us enjoy good things that are present. Let us speedily use the creatures as our youth. Let us fill ourselves with costly wine and ointment, and let not the flower of the time pass us by." So what he is saying here, and this we find Paul also mentioning in his writing. If you read a bit later on, he says, if there's no resurrection, why don't we just drink, eat, and die? And where did Paul get that thing from? If there is no resurrection, let us drink, eat, and die. It means that the Apostle Paul in this Roman Greco world also adopted the system which was written down here in the book of Wisdom, wherein he basically said, if there is no resurrection, there is nothing for us. There has to be a bodily, physical resurrection in order for us to have anything. That is what he is pointing to. Now, with that in mind, let us go to verse 20. It it says here, but now is Christ risen from the dead, and he became the first fruit of them that are slept. So Paul comes to his conclusion now, and he says, listen, Christ is risen from the dead. How was Jesus risen from the dead? There was no bones in his grave. He rose from the dead in a physical human body, wherein he is now seated at the right hand of God. And the beautiful thing that Paul comes and brings in here, he says, but now if Christ be risen from the dead and became the first fruit of them that are slept. For since, verse 21, by man death came, and death there in the mind of Paul, if we go and look at further on, we will still get to that passage, is the mindset of the Roman Greek world of that time, which was that let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. Like one of these Greek sayings was, I was not, I am, I will not be, why worry? So what? And that was engraved on many of the gravestones of the people of that time. They believed that they would just be nothing, and that there is no way you can get out of death, so let us just enjoy life now. And here Paul comes, he used the same logic, but he says, listen, there's a way out. There is a way back, and that is through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. He basically says, if there is no resurrection, let us eat, drink, and die. For why would we suffer the way we suffer if there is no bodily resurrection? And he says here that Jesus Christ, in his resurrection, became the first fruit. First fruit is mentioned in different places. You'll see there in the notes, Romans 8:23, 11:16, 16:5, 1 Corinthians 5:20, or 15:20, and so forth. And you can go, do yourself a favor, go and read those verses and see what first fruit mean. First fruit would be the first of something that is still to come. The first fruit you would see on a tree looks exactly like the fruit that is to come. So what he's saying is that this Jesus Christ in his resurrection was the first of many to have the exact same experience. We find a cross-reference to this basically. I can say it's a cross-reference. You'll find in your cross-references, although the context is a little bit different, but let's read it, Romans 8:23. It says, and not only they, but we ourselves, we who have the first fruit of the Spirit, even we ourselves, groan within ourselves, waiting for the adoption to witness the redemption of our body. So what is Paul saying? He says we have the Holy Spirit, which comes from the first fruit, which is Christ, bring also a first reaction in our lives on account of the resurrection, and yet we are now waiting for the redemption of our bodies. So he's saying that Jesus Christ was raised from the dead bodily, and he is the first of many to have exactly the same. The Greek-Roman mindset would read this passage, and unfortunately, this is how the church reads it as well. When it talks about the redemption of our body, it reads it as the redemption from our body. We will not have a redemption from our body, we will have a redemption of our body. Back in that Greek-Roman world, they believed that all matter is evil, which was standing in contradiction with what the Jews believed. If you go and read 1st and 2nd Maccabees and this Wisdom of Solomon and many other writings of the time, which was written in Greek by Jews, you would find that they use these Gnostic ways of thinking and incorporate the Jewish idea, which was that matter is not evil, but matter is good. Because God, when he created the heaven and the earth, he said, and behold, everything is good. Now, if we are good, if matter is good, if this world is good, if people are good, why would God let that which is good go to waste and just die? Because then God has lost what is good. The thing is that something bad happened with what is good, and God came in Jesus Christ, and He came to save man and save what is good from a very bad thing that's happening to it. For God's plan has always been to have heaven and earth collide and have an earth with people which would be equal with Him, with whom He can have a powerful friendship, and to whom He can actually give the kingdom, which is a great concept that we still have to, a great bridge that we still have to cross. And we will do that not in this session, but in this whole thing that we're doing in 1 Corinthians 15. The whole concept of the kingdom. When I read it and I see how that kingdom works and when we will receive the kingdom and what that is, I prayed, I said, oh God, you need to help me to explain this to the church, because we have not seen what this kingdom actually means and what it means on receiving the kingdom, when we'll receive the kingdom, and what it would look like. But it is clear in 1 Corinthians, and we will still talk about that. So what it says here is, in verse 24, this is Romans 8:24, that we are saved by hope, but hope that is seen is not hope. For what a man sees, why does he yet hope for it? But if we hope for it, which we see not, then we do it with patience. Likewise, the Spirit also helps our infirmities, for we know not what we should pray or how we ought to pray, but the Spirit itself makes intercession for us with groanings which cannot be uttered. Jesus Christ is the first fruit of many to be. I shared this with a friend of mine. He said to me, but Bertie, so when is this fullness now manifesting? As if we now have a frustration saying, okay, we are just postponing the hope, and that leaves us powerless. And I can understand where we in the Grace Church want to be at a place where we say, well, everything has happened, nothing more needs to happen, and we've got everything now. Now that is a great thing to say, because we immediately have this have from us removed the feeling of lack. But if you go and check your heart, you will still feel deep in your heart there is something more to be manifested. And how do you deal with that inner voice that tells you there is still something that must take place? The only way you can deal with it is by looking at at what God has promised, looking at what is outstanding. And if you can identify what is outstanding, and you can see that God made it His responsibility to bring that, you will not walk in this earth being tempted by the devil to manifest what God has promised. What God has promised us is that Jesus is the first fruit, and we that have received the Spirit, we are waiting for the adoption to see the full manifestation in our bodies. And Paul comes and he says here that while we have this hope keeps us secure. It protects our minds. The Bible calls this the helmet of the hope of salvation. So we've got a salvation that still needs to take place, which is wherein our bodies shall be saved from physical death, wherein we in our bodies will be immortal. We are waiting for that. But while we are waiting for that, we know that in our flesh we are weak. Therefore, we will not be tempted to find justification by our flesh, for we've already concluded that we cannot do that. We've already concluded that. And that keeps us safe. And Paul says here that saves us. Saves us from what? Saves us from living in fear today. Saves us from being crushed down by persecution and oppression and negative things that happens to us. Naked, peril, the sword, and so forth. Whatever he mentioned in Romans chapter 8. So let me try and summarize this. Jesus Christ is the first fruit, meaning there will be many like that. We are not yet seeing that, but the Spirit that will bring that immortal body forth is poured out in our hearts, and now that Spirit of life which is inside us, whereby we hope for this resurrection, waiting that that our bodies will be made immortal. As we wait upon that, this Spirit of Christ that raised Christ from the dead strengthens us now, encourages us now. And the way that Spirit encourages us is with signs of life called love and peace and joy and so forth. Glory to God.